In the autumn of 1879, in the red dust town of Corda Wells, New Mexico Territory, a young woman named Nora Vane stood in the yard behind her father's locksmith shop and watched the territorial marshal's men haul away everything her family had built over 20 years. The forge, the bench vices, the brass key blanks in their felt-lined drawers. The shop had survived drought, 2 fires, and the death of her mother. It did not survive the morning a deputy arrived with a court order and a wagon. Her father, Elias Vane, had died the previous spring owing a debt he had not owed. The records said otherwise. The records, filed at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, said Elias had borrowed against the shop and its lot in the winter of 1876 and had never repaid the principal. Nora had seen her father's ledger. She had kept it herself for the last 3 years, while his hands grew too stiff for fine work. There was no such loan. There had never been such a loan. The name on the creditor's line was the Corda Wells Commercial and Development Company, and its principal agent was a man named Horace Dull. Dull was not a violent man. He dressed carefully and spoke in complete sentences, and always brought a signed document to whatever meeting he attended. He had acquired, in the 3 years since he arrived in Corda Wells, the grain warehouse, 2 cattle allotments on the East Range, the deed to the old freighting yard, and now the locksmith shop on Main Street. He had acquired all of it through paperwork. Not a single acquisition had involved a threat. Nora found that more unsettling, not less. A man who uses violence leaves bruises. A man who uses paper leaves no marks at all. She was 26 years old, trained in lock mechanism and key work by her father since she was 9, and she had $42 and a leather satchel that held her father's tools. She did not weep on the day the shop was emptied. She stood in the yard and made a list of what she knew for certain and what she needed to learn. There were things about her father she understood only now that he was gone. She understood that he had built the shop not for himself, but for her, without ever saying so directly, in the manner of men of that era and place who did not announce their intentions but arranged circumstances and then waited to see if the arrangement took. He had taught her the pick set before he taught her the key blank. He had explained the workings of a lever tumbler before she was tall enough to see over the bench without a stool. He had let her attempt the difficult jobs while he watched, correcting her grip, but not her decision, telling her when she was wrong, but not always what the right answer was, requiring her to find it. She had resented this at 13. At 26, with his tools in her hands and his shop being carried out the door in another man's inventory, she understood it as a form of faith she had not recognized for what it was while she was receiving it. Elias Vane had died in the spring of 1879, with clear eyes and a clear conscience, having owed nothing to anyone, and having been cheated, though he did not know it, out of the thing he had spent 20 years building. That he did not know it was, she supposed, a mercy. That she knew it was not. If you have ever watched something your family spent a lifetime building be reduced to an inventory number in another man's ledger, stay with this story. What came next took patience, and it cost her more than money. What Nora knew for certain was plain enough. Her father had never signed a note to the Commercial and Development Company. He had told her so directly in the last coherent conversation she remembered having with him before his cough overtook his ability to speak at length. He had said, setting down a half-finished key and looking at his blistered knuckles, that a man named Dull had come to the shop in December of 1876 and offered to purchase the property, and Elias had declined. Dull had left without argument. Elias had thought nothing more of it. What Nora did not know was where the false note had come from, whose hand had signed her father's name and what proof, if any, had survived the years between that December and this autumn. The territorial courts required physical documents. Everyone in Corda Wells knew this, and Nora had learned it again in the most direct way available. She had ridden to Santa Fe 3 weeks after her father's burial, with $40 in her coat and his ledger wrapped in canvas against the dust. The ride was 2 days each way, and she had done it without complaint, and arrived at the office of an attorney named Brecht, who had been recommended to her by the minister in Corda Wells as a man of principle who occasionally worked for modest fees. Brecht had the unhurried manner of someone who has heard many claims and developed the habit of withholding his expression until he had reviewed what was in front of him. He spent 20 minutes with the ledger. He looked at the loan dates cited in the commercial and development company's filing. He compared the handwriting on the promissory note, which his office had obtained a copy of, with the entries in the ledger. He set both down and looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man about to say something he has said before and does not enjoy saying. "The ledger is compelling," he said. "It is not sufficient. A ledger kept by the debtor is the debtor's own record. The note is an instrument signed by your father. The territorial judge who examined it found the signature consistent. To overturn that ruling, I would need an original document with your father's signature that contradicts this note by its own terms, or a witness with direct knowledge of the signing and the circumstances surrounding it. Do you have either of those things?" She did not. She told him so. "Then I would not advise proceeding against the commercial and development company on the strength of what you have here," he said. His voice was not unkind. "What you have establishes doubt. Doubt is not a property instrument." She thanked him for his time and left. She did not spend the night in Santa Fe. She rode back the same evening until the horse needed rest, camped by the road, and arrived in Corda Wells the following morning. The commercial and development company had a promissory note, properly executed with a signature that a territorial judge had ruled resembled Elias Vane's hand sufficiently to stand. Nora needed something that could undo a judge's ruling. She needed paper that outweighed paper. She spent 6 weeks asking questions. She spoke with every merchant her father had done business with, every rancher who had brought him a padlock or a strongbox, every man who had been in Corda Wells in the winter of 1876 and could recall what Elias Vane was doing with his time and money that season. She was methodical about it. She kept a small notebook in her coat pocket and made brief entries after each conversation, not the content of what people said, but the shape of what they knew and what they did not. The overlapping edges of different accounts that might, if aligned correctly, point to something she had not yet seen. The merchants and ranchers remembered Elias Vane as a quiet man who did careful work and minded his affairs. Several spoke of him with a warmth that surprised her. She had known him as a father and as a craftsman. She had not always seen how he appeared to the rest of the town. The harness maker on 2nd Street had brought him a padlock toolbox every year for 7 years to have the cylinder cleaned and repinned. The woman who ran the dry goods store had relied on him to maintain the lock on her back storeroom, which held the season's credit ledgers and the deeds to a small parcel of land outside town. They spoke of him with the particular respect that small towns have for men who do one thing precisely and without fanfare. None of them knew anything about a chest or a loan or a man named Foss. Most of them remembered little about December of 1876, beyond the usual hazards of a high desert winter. 2 of them mentioned the same thing without prompting from her. In December of 1876, the outlaw called Red Curly Foss had passed through the territory, and Elias Vane had done a job for him. Nora knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Curly Foss had run a crew that robbed territorial express shipments for nearly 4 years. before a deputy marshal had cornered most of them in a box canyon outside Taos in the spring of 1877. Foss himself had been killed in that encounter, though the papers had been vague about how. His crew had scattered, and most of them had eventually been taken or died in the years after. What the territory had never recovered was the money from the last express job, a sum described variously in newspaper accounts as somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. The job her father had done for Curly Foss in December of 1876 was, according to the two merchants who remembered it, a chest, a heavy iron chest. Elias had rekeyed the lock and fitted a new internal mechanism to the existing case. He had not asked what was in it. That was not a locksmith's job. He had been paid in cash, $10, and the chest had left his shop in the bed of a wagon. Nora thought about that chest for 4 days. She sat in the room she was renting above the feed store and turned the information in all its directions and looked at what each arrangement suggested. She ate the meals she was given and did not taste them. She slept 6 hours a night and lay awake for 2 hours before and after, not from distress but from the methodical habit of her mind, which preferred to continue working rather than to stop. Foss had been killed in the spring of 1877. His money had never been found. The chest had left her father's shop in December of 1876. 3 months later, Dull had come to the shop and offered to buy the property. Her father had declined. 1 year after that, a note appeared in Dull's files bearing Elias Vane's signature. The shape of it was plain, if she was right. Foss had buried the chest before his death, or had it buried by someone who then died, or scattered. Dull had learned where it was, or believed he had, or was in a position to learn. He had known about the chest because he had been feeding information to Foss's crew, and at some point in that arrangement the location of the buried money had been discussed or disclosed. When Foss died and the crew scattered and the chest stayed in the ground, Dull had found himself with knowledge of its location, but no ability to retrieve it without drawing attention. The land it sat on was not his land. He needed the land. The locksmith who had rekeyed the chest was Elias Vane, whose shop sat on a lot adjacent to the route between town and the freighting yard, a lot that Dull had apparently decided he wanted for reasons that might have been commercial, or might simply have been convenience. Nora was not certain Dull had planned the shop acquisition specifically to recover the chest. She was more inclined to think he had moved on the shop because it was available, and its owner was dead, and leaving it to a daughter who could be displaced through paperwork, and that the chest had been a separate matter he had been managing in parallel, waiting for the right opportunity to retrieve it when the freighting yard was his, and the access was his, and no one was watching his movements closely. She was not yet certain. She needed to know where the chest was. The woman she went to see next was a Navajo elder named Delma, who ran a small trading post 8 miles out of Corda Wells on the road toward the eastern range. Delma was 70 years old and had been watching the territory change hands and change names since before most of its current residents had been born. She had known Elias Vane for 15 years, since he had ridden out one autumn to fix the padlock on her supply room without being asked, and had refused payment twice before accepting a meal. She ran the post with her daughter and a grandchild who was learning to read, and the post smelled of dried corn and lanolin and the particular dust of the road that was everywhere in the territory in the dry months. When Nora arrived and tied her horse and set her satchel on Delma's counter, Delma poured 2 cups of strong coffee, without being asked, and waited. She had a way of waiting that was not passive. It was the waiting of someone who understood that the other person was carrying something and needed the room to set it down, carefully rather than drop it. Nora told her everything. She did not summarize. She spoke every particular she had learned in 6 weeks of asking. And when she finished, she put her hands flat on the counter and said, "I need to know about a chest." Delma was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the far wall of the post where a shelf held a row of bolts of cloth in colors that had faded from their original brightness to the muted tones of long exposure to sun and dust. Then she said, "My nephew saw them burying it. He was 12 years old. He has never told anyone because he believed they would kill him for it." Nora asked nothing more. She waited in turn. "He has carried it since his 12th year," Delma said. "He has never spoken of it to me directly. He has come close, twice. Something always stopped him. I believe he decided that the people who buried that chest were gone, or dead, and the secret was therefore safe to keep, and that keeping it was safer than speaking it." She set down her cup. "He is wrong about the first part. Dull was not with them that night, but he knew the chest was there. He has been looking for it, I think, for a long time." Her nephew was a man of 30 now, named Tobias, who ran a small cattle operation on land his family had held for 3 generations. He came to the trading post that same afternoon, on foot, and he was not what she had expected. He was quiet and careful, and carried himself with the deliberate physical economy of someone who has worked the same land for many years. He did not speak immediately when Delma introduced them. He looked at Nora for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone who has just named the thing he has been carrying without knowing whether to set it down. Then he sat, and he spoke. He told her where the chest was buried. He had mapped it in his memory with the precision of a 12-year-old who understood that such knowledge was dangerous. Northeast of the old freighting yard, in a dry wash below a particular flat-topped mesa, under 3 feet of caliche and 2 stones set in a cross pattern. He had been in the hills that evening, he said, returning from a cousin's camp, and he had heard the sound of digging and had gone still against a boulder until the men finished and left. There had been 3 of them. He had not known who they were. He had known only that men who buried things in the dark were not men to introduce yourself to, and he had stayed until the sound of their horses faded before continuing home. He had told no one. He had thought of it often. He was glad, he said in a voice that had no particular inflection, to be done with carrying it. The old freighting yard was now the property of the Corda Wells Commercial and Development Company. Nora went that night. She waited until 2 hours after the last lamp went dark in the properties adjoining the freighting yard, then saddled her horse in the dark behind the feed store and rode out of town by the back road, keeping off the main ruts. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that comes in off the high desert in October and settles into the marrow. She had wrapped her hands in cloth under her gloves, and she could still feel the chill working through. She took 2 tools from her satchel, the long pry bar her father had used for anchor bolts and the smallest of his pick set, a narrow tension wrench with a worn grip that fit her hand exactly. She took her lantern but didn't light it until she was off the road and into the scrub beyond the freighting yard's north fence. She climbed the fence at a post where the wire had sagged, crossed the yard's hard-packed ground, keeping close to the brush line, and found the dry wash at the northeast corner where the property backed against the mesa's lower slope. The wash was dry and smelled of alkali and cold stone. The moonlight was thin but sufficient to navigate by once her eyes had adjusted. She found the crossed stones in less than 20 minutes. Tobias had mapped it perfectly. The stones were pale caliche, each about the size of a man's boot, set at a deliberate angle to each other, and they were the only stones in the wash that had been placed rather than fallen. She moved them aside with her hands and lit the lantern low, shielding it toward the bank. She spent the next 2 hours digging. The caliche was dense and fractured in unpredictable ways, some sections soft enough to scoop with the pry bar's flat end, others requiring the full weight of her shoulders to break. Her arms ached through the first hour and found a different gear in the second, the deep mechanical endurance that comes when the body understands there is no alternative to continuing. She had grown up next to a forge. There was nothing frail in her hands or her shoulders. The pry bar found something solid at 3 feet, and she cleared around it with her hands until she had the dimensions of the thing, running her fingers along its edges in the dark to understand its shape before she tried to move it. Then she levered it free of the earth in 3 careful stages, the caliche releasing it with the grudging unwillingness of ground that has held something long enough to forget. It was not always there. It was a flat-topped iron chest, approximately 16 inches wide and 10 inches deep, secured by a lever tumbler lock of the type common to express company security boxes of the 1870s. The case was corroded but solid. The lock was her father's work. She recognized the plate shaping and the keyway profile as distinctly his. He had always filed the keyway entry at a 6-degree angle rather than the standard 5, a habit she had picked up from watching him and never thought to correct in herself. She sat on the caliche for a moment with her lantern close and looked at her father's work. He had done this job in December of 1876. He had not known what was inside, or had not wanted to know, which in a locksmith amounts to the same professional posture. He had rekeyed the lock, which meant the original key no longer opened it, and a new key existed that Curly Foss had carried. Foss was dead. No key. She thought of her father's hands on this case, 3 years before her sitting here. The same case, the same cold iron, the same keyway his file had shaped. She did not know whether he had wondered in the years after what the chest held. She suspected not. He had been a man who completed a job and moved to the next one, and did not carry idle questions about the work behind him. Nora reached into her satchel for the pick set. Her father had taught her to read a lock before she touched it, the way a carpenter reads the grain of a board before driving a nail. She examined the keyway under the lantern light, tilting it to catch the reflection off the pin faces, looking for the slight misalignment at the shear line that would tell her where the binding pin sat and in which direction the tension should pull. She found it. The binding pin was the 3rd of 5, misaligned a fraction toward the 9:00 position, which told her the plug was turning left. She fitted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied the lightest possible pressure, the pressure of a finger resting rather than pushing, and felt the plug resist in the way of something that has not turned in 3 years and has no memory of turning. She began on the first pin, a single lift of the pick, the first pin set against the tension, and she held it and moved to the second. The second set quickly. She was not a woman who celebrated small victories in the middle of work. She noted the second pin and continued. The third resisted. Stuck. The corrosion had swollen it in its chamber, and it sat without yielding to the pick's pressure. She held her tension and waited, the way her father had taught her to wait, without adjusting and without releasing, simply maintaining the steady light pull that said to the mechanism that she was still there and still patient. Her father had said that a corroded pin is not a locked pin. It is a slow pin. The distinction matters. A locked pin requires force. A slow pin requires only the willingness to outlast it. She had learned the difference at age 13, on a padlock off a river barge that had been underwater for 2 seasons, and she had not forgotten it. The pin gave, not gradually the way the others had, but all at once, which was the nature of corrosion and not a surprise. She continued to the fourth without pausing. The fourth pin sat easily as if grateful. The fifth took another long pause, the same quality of waiting, the same refusal to hurry. Then the plug turned slowly, the full 90 degrees of rotation, and the bolt retracted with a sound like a small thing being released from a long grip, and the chest opened. She looked inside for the first time without any certainty of what she would find. The money was there. Paper currency banded with string, stacked in near-even columns across the bottom of the chest. She noted the denominations without counting. The sum was real and substantial. She could see well enough in the lantern light that the total was likely toward the higher end of what the newspapers had described. She did not touch it beyond moving the first stack aside to see what lay beneath. Under the currency, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against the ground's cold damp, were 3 documents. She lifted the oilcloth aside with careful hands and held the lantern over each one in turn, reading slowly, reading twice, giving each document the full attention it warranted before moving to the next. The first was a tally sheet in Foss's hand, a list of the amounts taken in each of the crew's express jobs, with dates and locations noted in a cramped economical script. The total at the bottom matched the currency in the chest within $50. She set it aside. The second was a letter, written in the same hand but more careful. The script of someone composing rather than recording, addressed to no one in particular. That described a transaction. Foss had paid a sum of $400 to a man identified only as HD for information about express shipment schedules. The payments had been made in 3 installments, beginning in October of 1876. HD had provided timetables, routes, and the combination sequence for the primary express box, and had been paid through a cutout at Dull's own office in Corda Wells. H.D. Horace Dull. Nora read the letter 3 times. She was not a woman given to trembling, but her hands were cold when she folded the letter along its original crease and set it carefully aside. The cold was not entirely from the night air. The third document was a promissory note. It was dated December 1876. It bore her father's name in the payee line and an amount of $600. It was not a loan. It was a payment. A payment for the rekeying job. She understood immediately. $600. Her father had been paid $10. Foss had recorded $600 in his accounts and pocketed the difference. The note was Foss's own record of an inflated expense, meant to obscure how much cash he was carrying versus how much he had actually spent. It was a bookkeeping fraud inside the accounts of a criminal enterprise. It was also in the column where the payee's acknowledgement was recorded, signed by Elias Vane. A legitimate signature, a real signature. Her father had signed a document of Foss's creation in December of 1876, not knowing what he was signing, because Foss had told him it was a receipt, and he had been a man who signed receipts without reading them in detail. A man who trusted that a customer's word about a document's contents was sufficient. Dull had known about this note. He had known because Foss had told him, or because someone in the crew had. And when Foss died and the chest went unfound, Dull had obtained this note through some means and had rewritten its terms at the Territorial Land Office into the false promissory loan that now held the shop. The note's original text described a payment to a locksmith. Dull had used that authentic signature to underpin a fraudulent filing. She sat in the dry wash for a long time, with the 3 documents in her lap. The night was cold, and the stars over the mesa were very clear. The kind of sky that appears in the high desert after the last of the day's heat has pulled upward and left nothing behind but darkness and altitude. She thought about the shape of what she was holding and what it meant, and, more precisely, what it would mean to a territorial judge who had not been present in the wash with her tonight. The letter implicated Dull in the express robberies as an informant. That was one thing, and it was a criminal matter, and it belonged to the marshal's office. The note was another thing entirely, and it was the thing she had come for. She needed the original, her father's actual signature on Foss's document, not a copy and not a description, but the paper itself. Brecht had told her that. An original document with her father's signature that contradicted the note by its own terms. Here it was, 3 years in the ground, preserved by oilcloth and cold, and the particular disinterest of the earth in what men have hidden in it. Then she put the documents back in the oilcloth, latched the chest, and carried it to her horse. She rode not back to Coeur Wells, but south and east, across the range in the full dark, pushing the horse at a pace that was urgent without being reckless. She understood that what she was carrying needed to be in the hands of a recognized authority before morning. The chest's extraction from the commercial and development company's land was not a crime, she believed, because the chest was the property of no living person with a clear claim, and the documents inside it were not the company's property by any legal theory she could construct. She believed this. She also understood that what she believed and what a territorial judge would rule were not necessarily the same thing, and that the window between tonight and the moment Dull learned the chest was gone was a window she needed to close. She arrived in Callaway at the house of a circuit judge named Harmon, who was known to be difficult to influence and easy to find. She arrived at his house before dawn and knocked. He answered in his dressing gown with a lamp and the particular expression of a man who has learned not to be surprised by who arrives at a judge's door before sunrise. She laid out everything on his kitchen table, the documents, the chest, the currency, which she had not touched beyond moving the oilcloth. She set each item in the order she wanted him to encounter it, the tally sheet first, then the letter, then the note. She explained what each document was and how she understood it, and what its relationship was to the territorial filing in Santa Fe, and to the promissory note that had been used to take her father's shop. She did not editorialize. She stated what the documents said, what the filing said, and what the difference between them implied. She spoke for 40 minutes. When she finished, Judge Harmon looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. He was a heavy-set man with a beard going gray and a habit of tapping his forefinger against the table when he was thinking. He tapped for a full 2 minutes before he looked up. "You will need a sworn witness to the extraction," he said finally. "I have one," she said. "He is 30 years old and has been waiting 18 years to say what he saw." What happened in the following weeks moved through the territorial machinery at the pace such things move, which is not fast and is not dramatic. There were sworn statements to be taken, and a notarized inventory of the chest's contents to be prepared. There was a court-appointed examiner from Santa Fe who traveled to Callaway and spent 3 days reviewing the documents, including a careful comparison of the signature on the false promissory note filed by Dull with the signature on Foss's original payment record. His written conclusion was that the signatures were the same hand, which was consistent with Nora's theory that Dull had obtained Foss's note and submitted it to the Territorial Land Office under revised terms, retitling the payment as a loan. The examiner was precise about what he could and could not establish, in the way of men who understand that precision in these matters is not timidity, but armor. He could establish the signatures were the same. He could not establish how Dull had obtained the note or what arrangement, if any, had existed between Dull and Foss's associates after Foss's death. The marshal's office would pursue those questions separately. Tobias gave his sworn account of the burial in a statement that named the date as clearly as a 12-year-old's memory could hold, the location with the precision of a man who had visited the spot many times in his mind across 18 years, and the number of men he had observed. He gave it plainly and without elaboration and did not add anything he was not certain of. Delma was present as a witness to the swearing. She sat in the back of the examiner's temporary office in Callaway and watched her nephew complete the act he had been unable to complete for 18 years, and she said nothing. There was nothing to say. The letter identifying H.D. as an informant in the express robberies was turned over to the Territorial Marshal's office. That marshal's office dispatched 2 deputies to Corda Wells on a Wednesday morning. Horace Dull was at his office when they arrived. His attorney was present. The attorney was a careful man, and he did what careful attorneys do when the documents themselves have turned, which was to speak slowly and ask for everything to be verified and to take up as much time as the law allowed. It did not change the shape of the situation. The commercial and development company's claim to the locksmith shop lot rested on a promissory note whose underlying document had now been produced in its original form with its original meaning, and the two did not say the same thing. The company dissolved before Christmas. Its other holdings reverted to the territorial court for adjudication of valid and fraudulent claims, a process that would take years and would result in the restoration of several properties to their original owners and the permanent erasure of the commercial and development company from the territorial record. Dull himself left Corda Wells. Where he went was not precisely known and was not of great concern to Nora or to anyone else involved in the matter. He had become irrelevant in the way that a document becomes irrelevant when the record it relied on is corrected, which is quietly and without ceremony. The sheriff of Corda Wells arrived at the land office on a Thursday afternoon looking for Nora Vane. He had heard she had been to see Judge Harmon, and that there were documents and a chest involved, and that the territorial marshal had sent men. He wanted to understand what had happened and whether there was still something to be done. The clerk at the land office told him that Miss Vane had been there Tuesday morning, 2 days before, with a notarized inventory and a territorial court order, and had already filed the counterclaim to the locksmith shop lot. He arrived, in other words, after the chest had been opened and the documents read and the filings made. The work was complete. There was nothing left for him to do. The locksmith shop on Main Street was returned to the estate of Elias Vane in February of 1880. Nora did not move back into it immediately. There were repairs to make that the shop's months of vacancy and the rough handling of the inventory removal had left behind. The forge needed relining, the fire brick cracked from cold and disuse. The windows needed new glazing on the south side, where the winter had worked into the old putty. The bench had been sold at inventory and she had to find it, which took 2 months and a negotiation with a man in Callaway who had purchased it from the auction agent without knowing its provenance. When she explained whose bench it had been and why she wanted it back, he looked at the bench and then at her and asked whether she had made an offer, or whether he should. She made the offer. He accepted it without negotiation. She brought the bench back on a borrowed wagon in the rain. She lit the forge for the first time in early spring. She had brought in new fire brick and had laid it herself, a job her father had always done himself because he said a man who does not know his forge does not know his work, and she understood now why he had believed this. She built the fire slowly, the way he had taught her, letting the brick warm through before she asked anything from the heat. The heat came up through the flue and the shop filled with the smell of hot iron and coal smoke that she had grown up breathing. And she stood with her hand on the bench and let it fill her and thought of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of thought. Tobias came to the reopening. Delma came. A few of the merchants her father had served over the years came and stood in the doorway and said things that were quiet and direct, the kind of things men say when they have been wrong in their assessment of a situation and want to acknowledge it without a speech. The harness maker on 2nd Street shook her hand and said her father had been a steady man, and he was glad the shop was open again, and she thanked him and meant it. She thanked them and set them to work or sent them home, depending on what the shop needed in that hour. There was enough work in the first week to establish that the shop's customers had not found alternatives they preferred in its absence, and that was enough to begin. The currency from the chest went to the territorial court, which eventually distributed it to the express company that had been robbed. The process took 4 years and involved considerable paperwork, but it was completed. Nora had not wanted the money. She had wanted the documents, and the documents had been enough. Foss's original note, the one that showed her father's real signature and the real terms of a $10 lock job, was filed in the Territorial Court Archive in Santa Fe. It sat next to the false promissory note that Dull had used, and the comparison was instructive to anyone who looked. Nora went to Santa Fe once to see them both filed properly, and she stood at the clerk's counter and watched the man stamp the folder and set it in the drawer. And she thought of her father's hands, how careful they had been with small things, how precisely they had known the interior of a lock, how little he had known about the larger mechanisms that had been working around him. The locksmith shop on Main Street operated for another 31 years under the name Vane and Sons, though for the first 15 of those years there were no sons, only Nora. And the name was a piece of her father that she carried forward because she chose to. She kept his pick set in a leather roll on the bench where he had always kept it. The tension wrench with the worn grip, the one that fit her hand exactly, she used almost every day. She did not replace it with a newer one, though she made dozens of better ones over the years for customers. There was no reason to replace something that worked. If you know what it is to hold a thing that someone you loved made useful, and to make it useful again, leave a word below. There are more stories like this one, patient and unhurried, waiting further along.